Okay, class, this is my introductory nonfiction notes. This is a series of 2 videos that you'll watch tonight and then another one on Wednesday. At the end, there will be a quiz on this. In fact, the quiz will be on Friday of this week. The idea of the introductory nonfiction notes is that it introduces you to the background information that you need for AP English language. It takes you through that breadth and depth so that you understand where the language came from and where we're going as a whole. Now, normally I don't share my notes as in my Google Docs or my Google Slides with everybody, but in this case I'm going to because it's 20 slides worth of information over 2 videos. Each video will be really close to 15 minutes, so I want you to be able to focus on the information and listening to what is being said versus having to sit there and scroll down all of the notes. Once you've watched the videos, you can go to the Google Slides that I posted on Google Classroom, and then you can print them, you can write them. It is your option. But the idea is that I want you to focus on the words that are being used and what I'm discussing today versus the taking the notes. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is the idea of the different types of nonfiction. Now, nonfiction definition is pieces of literature that are presented as fact. So, like Go Ask Alice, it was originally presented like it was a fact, and that happened and that was someone's diary, so it was presented as nonfiction, and we didn't find out till decades later that it was actually a work of fiction. Now, keeping in mind, nonfiction has a variety of genres. The genres you actually see here, there are many listed. A lot of these we will not see this year. We'll see them next year instead, but we definitely will focus here. The idea here, though, is that in recent century, that the difference between fiction and nonfiction has become rather blurred. You will notice this as we look here specifically at the one called creative nonfiction. In the sense of how it looks and feels, is that it feels more fictional. We get the same idea with Go Ask Alice and how that fits in here. Now, some of the popular genres that we're going to cover this year is autobiography, biography. You are going to actually write your own blog, and we'll get into that. We will look at some diaries and journals. We will definitely do some debating, some editorials. We will talk about eyewitness accounts. Fable we'll save more for next year. We are definitely going to hit history and historical commentary rather large. Letters, memoirs, monologue we save more for AP Lit. We will look at some personal reminiscence. There are many political cartoons. In fact, there's one within this set of slides, which will be covered in the next video. We'll look at some movie reviews, and you'll actually be writing some reviews of your own. Satire. We will not really cover sermons, but we will talk about sermons. And then there's this idea of social criticism, which we will talk about when we're getting into the satire aspect. But most of all, what we will spend our time on is this idea of speeches, because it is the most prevalent nonfiction work, as well as this idea of history and historical commentary that we are looking at. Now, the purpose of writing. We've talked about the purpose, and I've gone over the idea of soapstone with you, and we've talked in the textbook about this idea of purpose. And the purpose is why the author wrote the piece of literature and what they are trying to achieve, influence, or change. It doesn't always mean they're trying to persuade, and they can have more than one purpose, but it's what are they actually trying to achieve through the piece of literature. Now, there are 7 main purposes. This, again, does not mean that they're the only ones. To inform, to persuade, to entertain, to satirize, to inspire, to reflect, and to document. Now, these, when we look at soapstone, are usually the more popular ones. These are the ones that people use the most, or authors use the most on what they're trying to get across. But when it comes to soapstone and what we're looking for, I will very rarely let you actually use these as your answers. And that's because I want you to start to think outside of the box. I want you to think more creatively and think at a more elevated level so that you are prepared for that AP test at the end of the year when it comes to analyzing the various types of literature on the AP test, because there is more out there than just these 7. Plus, there are synonyms for these 7 that are much better, and we will use those and discuss those as we're looking at the various soapstone for the various pieces of literature that we are covering this year. Now, we're going to talk about this idea of rhetorical modes, and the rest of the video will be about rhetorical modes. So rhetorical mode is a strategy, a way or method of presenting a subject through writing or speech. So it's how they actually performed their use of rhetoric, how they organized it, how they developed their ideas, what order they put them in, what pattern they used it, but it's also used to achieve a particular effect within the reader. Now, we've talked about this idea of rhetoric and this idea that rhetoric is usually a way of persuading people within that work of text. Okay, now when you're looking at rhetorical mode, it's how that text is put together along with the purpose to actually get it across so that someone is actually paying attention and they match. The purpose needs to match the rhetorical mode. And when I go through each of these, you'll start to understand what I mean with that. Now, the first one we have is narration. Narration is usually the more common one that you will see, or what you have seen in the past. It's the idea of presenting events in the past, present, or future in a story. So you're telling a story. So in a narrative, we're focusing on facts, which means very much historical backgrounds. We're recreating an experience for readers, as in a personal essay. We're using an anecdote. We're also envisioning images of the future, as in we're proposing for a new policy or a project. So you're narrating or telling a story. You're using your words within the story to persuade someone. It's that rhetorical mode. So usually with this, you're trying to illustrate or you're trying to persuade within your purpose. Now the next one is a description. Description is used to create images of a place or an object. It usually sketches out something or provides images that evoke and share a feeling. It uses your five senses. Now it's important that you know the five senses. So the idea that you can hear something, you can smell something, you can see something, you can taste something. Notice I left the fifth one out on purpose. Now, you have two ideas of description. You have subjective and you have objective. Subjective is the idea that it has an emotional impact on your senses, as in it focuses more on the personal essay and more the emotion and fits more with what you'll learn the next couple of days, this idea of pathos. So it's that emotional aspect. Objective description sticks with the physical details. It's very scientific, it's very technical, and fits with the idea of logos, or the logical aspects. Okay, classification and division. Classification is a way of grouping individual entities into categories based on their similarities. It offers an opportunity to explore similarities within groups and then explain the differences and relationships between the groups. So usually you will have a classification when you're talking about something scientific, like a biology system or a psychology system, and the idea of how things are grouped within that, and you're classifying them. So usually you're trying to educate or inform someone within this classification. Now a division is is the opposite of the classification, where when you take the whole and you break it into parts. So it offers you that chance to explain the subject in detail and to highlight the relationship of its parts. So a classification is broken into categories based on their similarities and differences, whereas a division, you start with the whole thing and then you break it down. Definition and illustration. When you introduce a term or a concept to the reader, and the writer must clearly and accurately define it. Because the reader isn't always aware of a definition of something or what the reader means by it, it is imperative and important that the author do this. So an extended definition is a fuller, more elaborate definition than what a dictionary would provide. It's not just a couple of words, it's not just a sentence, it's usually a paragraph or two paragraphs or an entire essay or speech. On the other hand, an illustration refers to the use of detailed examples It makes abstract or general ideas into more concrete and specific. This is where your 5 senses come in as well. You're getting very detailed in there so that you're seeing that illustration and you're taking that definition to a deeper level where the person can actually imagine that they're there and that that item is sitting right in front of them. The next one, compare and contrast. This is a popular essay type that we will focus on this year, but it's an essay or a paragraph that explores both the similarities and the differences between 2 or more items, ideas, trends, or works. When you arrange compare and contrast paragraphs, it is important that you do it in a specific way. So you have the idea of subject by subject organization, where you could, if I'm saying compare and contrast World War I with World War II, so you could spend 1 paragraph on World War I, 1 paragraph on World War II. That still is that you're comparing and contrasting, because whatever you mentioned in paragraph 1 for World War I, in paragraph 2 you could say, unlike World War I, World War II does this. Or like World War I, World War II did this. So you have the idea, the option of there, but you're discussing the subjects separately. Or you have the idea of the point-by-point organization, where you're taking the main features of what you're discussing and you're putting in the facts itself. So if you were to chart World War I and World War II, you would come up with some main points that were similar and main points that were different, and you would talk about those points, not necessarily the subject itself. Okay, so you need to figure out how you want to organize it itself. A process/analogy. A process is used to provide readers with directions. It's like a manual. It's a how-to. It could be a recipe. It could be instructions on how to put something together. Usually it has steps or stages that are clearly labeled, and usually it's done in chronological order, as in I did this today, I did that tomorrow. You follow this step first, then you do that step. An analogy compares topics that at a glance seem quite different. So a well-chosen analogy can make unfamiliar information, like technological information, seem more commonplace and understandable. The idea is, so if you're comparing putting something together with something else that makes it easier for people to understand, like putting something together compared with like eating something, it helps them to be able to function and understand the analogy versus the more complex topic itself. Cause and effect. This is the last one, I think. Yes, correct. It is the last one for today. So cause and effect strategy is employed when you're tracing the causes of a particular event or a situation to describe its effects, or both. Usually we're going to look at this idea of historical causation, this idea of what caused the war, and you'll see this a lot in your APUSH classes. What led up to World War II, what led up to the Civil War, what caused it, and then the idea of what effect or what outcome you have at the end. Now, in this idea of cause and effect, we also have this idea of logical fallacy. When we look at logical fallacies, we will look more detailed and more in depth at them when we look at Unit 3, which has to do with argument. But this one here, post hoc ergo propter hoc, it's that idea of asking you to look at the causes of something. So after this, therefore, because of this, so that's what the Latin translation into English, it claims about causation are based simply on observed temporal sequence. So what they're saying is the effect is based on faulty logic. And when we look at the logical fallacies, we'll see that within there. Okay, that's the end of today's video. So today's video, we discussed the rhetorical strategies, we discussed the definition of nonfiction, and the genres that we have. Tomorrow in class, or Wednesday in class, we will actually take this information and we'll do an activity or two with it at the beginning, and then you will have your next video on Wednesday that covers the next part. Okay, have a great day off and see you on Wednesday.